Our next speaker has a lot of experience with one of the largest open source communities in the world. Here to share his lessons learned, one of the creators of Kubernetes and a distinguished engineer at Microsoft, please put your hands together for Brendan Burns.
Hey there. How's everybody doing? Good? All right, cool. So I want to talk today about my experience with open source and a little bit of history, some lessons learned. This is my first time through this deck, so it could be over in 5 minutes. It could be over in 45. We'll see. All right. I wanted to give you a little bit of a perspective on my personal history here. The very first open source project that I got involved with as a participant as opposed to a user was this project called JMeter, which is a load tester. And I started with that a long time ago in 1999 when I actually had some load that I needed to put on a website. I moved on from that. I went into graduate school and I was doing a PhD, and I happened to be playing a bunch of Quake 2. And I wanted to use my joystick, and so I sort of started to contribute to the Quake 2 project for Linux after it had open sourced it, and ended up being a maintainer there. And if there's a story here, it's kind of like I accidentally my way into being maintainers on a couple of projects. I did a PhD in robotics, which I used a ton of open source from this project called OpenCV, which many of you've used, that Intel released for image processing. The Open Dynamics engine, which is just a fantastic physics simulator, because it turns out that when you're driving around $500,000 robots, it's better to crash them in simulation than in reality. So we did a lot of work in simulation, found a lot of bugs in simulation before we moved on. I worked on this project called Droid Draw, which was sort of one of my first things that I created from scratch. It was a WYSIWYG GUI editor for Android. So when Android came out, it didn't have a WYSIWYG GUI editor, and you had to write XML, and that was not good. And so created this tool to help me build some Android apps. I then went into the software industry, where not everything is open, and worked on some closed source software for about 4+ years. Used a lot of open source technology there, but wasn't really contributing. And it was really interesting because I sort of put my head down into a closed source world in a pre-cloud era. And then in 2012, after some big corporate reorgs, I popped my head back up into cloud. And a whole bunch of stuff that had happened in open source during that time period that I really just hadn't been paying any attention to. And it was a really fascinating moment because I entered into sort of the dark ages, I would say, in the open source as library, open source as tool era, where people built libraries that were useful or built tools that were useful. And I popped my head up into the open source as distributed application and configuration manager and system software orchestration kind of technology era. And just orienting myself to that new world after having been away from it for a long time was really both exciting and really interesting to see how the world sort of evolved. And when we started looking into cloud, I was looking at a lot of the technologies around Chef and Cloud Init and a bunch of the other sort of how do you take applications and deploy them out to the cloud. And that led to, in the conjunction with Docker mainstreaming containers, that led to the development of this project that became Kubernetes. And actually was sort of, the light bulb went off a few blocks over there after the first Docker meetup in Seattle in the late fall of 2012. And sort of ever since then, that's been that. And that's been interesting because it's turned into this amazing learning opportunity about how do you build communities and how do you scale, and just like every year there was a great quote that said something like, every order of magnitude the problem changes. And it's just so true, and we'll talk through that a little bit. So that's sort of my history that leads me up here, and I hope this is interesting. I wanted to talk about why we build open source software, and starting with JMeter is a great example because JMeter is a useful tool. I don't think anybody's ever going to build a business on the back of a load testing tool. I don't think that anybody's ever going to be like at a party and be like, yeah, I created a load testing tool. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I don't want to prejudge, but it's never worked for me. But it's the sort of thing where it's like, if we all built it separately, they would all be really bad bash scripts, right? And we probably all have, actually. But if we build as a community, we get to share our effort. And actually, I went and grabbed some screenshots to put these slides together. I drew those icons in, I don't even remember what the pixel editor was on Linux in 2002, but I drew those icons, and you'll note, actually, I was kind of a Java person at the time, and they kind of have the Java purple in them, because that was where my head was at, and so I drew those icons, and they're still in the project, right? And that's crazy. And so when we all bring our different sets of skills, and we collaborate better as a result, and I think that's an amazing class of open source software where we say, you know what? We need this tool. It's really useful. If we do it by ourselves, we'll build lousy tools. We can all work together. No one's really gaining any advantage over anyone else, but it's just more useful. And I think that's really great. And that's an important component of why we go ahead and have these communities come together. It's a very sort of utilitarian approach. I think one of the things that's interesting about when I moved on to working on Droid Draw was this idea that you can actually tell someone that something new can exist and can make their lives better. So I think everybody kind of knew that you need a load testing tool. It's obvious that if you're going to run a website, you should probably load test it. I think that for a lot of people who are sort of struggling through, how the heck do I figure out how to use these weird XML objects to create a GUI? There were designers before, so clearly it's not like it was oh my gosh, you could do it in a GUI. But I think that one of the things that was interesting here is that I just started kicking the software out because I was annoyed, and this group of people suddenly formed up around me. I wasn't even anticipating it, right? It was just all of it. I had this itch, and I did something, and I put it up on a mailing list somewhere. And all of a sudden, there are all these people who are eagerly awaiting the next release, and could you do this, and could you do that? And that ability to kind of empower a large group of people who may never actually contribute, but who are having a better time because they're using the software that you build, and then eventually some people contribute as well, becomes another really prime motivator for open source, right? It's really, I know, at least for me, one of the defining characteristics of all of the software that I've loved to build has been that it has empowered other people, right? And I think that we go and we want to try and make people's lives easier, and we do these in different places, right? So I use a ton of, open source browsers and music players and other stuff like that. I've never contributed to any of those. They've made my life better. I come and build tools like this, and hopefully I've made other people's lives better. And so it's not necessarily that we all work on the same thing like we did with JMeter, but actually that we each build our own tools that are the things that we're interested in or just happen to be the gap that we saw, and we uplift the complete set of software that's available to us. And so I think it's another really interesting idea, and also sort of how we, the first moments when that community comes together, when everyone says, oh man, that's a great idea. I think the most interesting thing for me, that when I looked back and I sort of popped my head up in 2012, was that I think cloud fundamentally changed all of this. And I think that the reason that cloud, and I have a very broad definition of cloud, which generally means writing applications across multiple servers in not a client server kind of way. It can be in your data center, I don't care. But the notion that we need to build and deploy at scale in a reliable way to services that are up 24/7 is sort of what I think of when I say cloud. And it really changed the world, I think, in two ways. One is because there's really right now, and I think this is a problem, but really right now, there's not a great way to package and deploy distributed systems. There's bits and pieces here and there, but not in the same way that I could put a CD into a drive and double click and then it just sort of ran for the next 5 years. And that means that in some ways the software industry has a challenge, right? Because you can either build clouds or you can consume clouds, and the software industry in the middle is figuring things out, and I think that's why the discussion about open source and open source business model in Nell's first talk is so relevant and interesting. Because we're still figuring out, how do we create a software industry in the middle? But it also meant that, oh my gosh, there's all of this complexity, and we need to wrangle our way around this complexity, and so we're going to have to build tools together, and we're going to have to share stuff, because if you tried to build it from scratch, you just would never even get started, right? And so I think that was the interesting thing about cloud as well, is you start seeing all of these tools exploding in the open source, because the business model is tricky, and there's just a ton of complexity that you need to solve. And it really, I think, fundamentally changed the way that people thought about open source. And then also there was this, Red Hat had sort of proven out that you could actually build open source business models. And so there was also an interest around, well, hey, there's this cloud thing, there's a lot of interest in open source. There's probably there's business models in here somewhere. And so there was a lot of sort of like venture capital interest in open source as well. And so that was sort of a fundamental foundational change in what happened. But I wanted to shift from sort of why we build open source to think about building open source communities. And I think when I've talked to a lot of people about this subject. I've had a lot of people come to me and say, hey, like, we want to do a thing that looks like that thing that you did. And the very first thing I say to them is, why? Right? Like, why do you want to do this? Like, you shouldn't want to do this just because it's cool. You should have a really grounded reason. You work for a company, you're interested in stuff. There's a reason why you want to open source. And I think this is a fundamental misconception for a lot of people, is like they think of open source as a category, right? And it's not. There's a bunch of different categories of open source. Open source, literally means, hey, the source is out there under an open license, but the idea behind an open source project is motivated by something. You wouldn't just open source just for the sake of open sourcing. You open source with a reason in mind. And so I think the important question, when I don't just say why and walk out, I say, what kind of community are you looking to build? Right? If you're building an open source and you're trying to create open source, it's because you're trying to create a community. So what kind of community are you trying to build? I think that the first kind of community that, well, maybe not the first, but one of the important categories of community is this notion of open for partners. Right? And there is a class of open source that is open source largely because you want to partner with 3 or 4 other people, and you don't necessarily trust each other. And you need some place where you can place this thing that you're going to collaborate on, so that if someone decides to not be nice, you're still protected. So you're opening it not because you want a broad community, not because you really necessarily are that into open source, but it's just the practical way to provide a forum for collaboration amongst a small set of people. And I think Android is a perfect example of this, right? Like, there's a small set of handset manufacturers out in the world. That's why that project is open source. There's really almost no other reason why that project is open source, in my mind anyway. I think the next step up from that is where you look at something like single vendor open source. Someone once joked to me, actually, that single vendor open source was the new closed source. And it's sort of true at some level, except for I think that when you look at single vendor open source, it's because actually it's just more pragmatic and more useful and more interesting for the world if the project is out in the open, and there's just no reason not to. Right? So if you look at the open sourcing of .NET, I'm sure, and in fact I know that there have been people from the community who have contributed to .NET, but I'm not sure that that was the motivation, right? I think that it was really put out into the open because it was the right thing to do, and they thought that they could execute faster and in a more open way with the community of users, but it wasn't because they necessarily wanted contributions. And I think there's a lot of open source projects that fit into this model. Chrome is another one that fits into this model, where it's open, but it's not really trying to build a community of developers working on it. And there's a lot of value in that too, right? I mean, I think both .NET and Chrome have been very successful being single-vendor open source projects. Chrome is now a multi-vendor open source project, I guess. And then I think another version of an open source community is sort of open for collaboration. I think if you look at the Linux kernel, it's a good example of that. Like, a bunch of people around the world want to collaborate. Open source is the right way to do that. They belong to different companies and everything else like that. They need to come together and collaborate. But they're not really necessarily looking to build a large community. Right? There's a large community of people who use Linux. I don't think that I'm trying not to speak for people, but my sense is that within the kernel community, increasing the number of GitHub stars or increasing the number of people, it's just not a focus, right? But they need to be able to collaborate, and open source is the way that they collaborate. And then I think, finally, when you look at something like Kubernetes, we really set out to build a community. right? We knew that we had to have an ecosystem. We knew that ultimately we needed users to support each other and be successful and do all of the great stuff that Nell was talking about in the very beginning. We had to go out and build that community. And that can also be a reason for open source. It's not just about collaboration around the source. It's actually about an open community of people working together in all sorts of venues. We have docs people. We have contributor experience people. We have people who are ensuring that the code of conduct on our Slack channel is okay. Like, there's a lot of different people out in this open community that make up what we think of as the project. And I think that it's inescapable that this thing wouldn't have been successful if we hadn't gone and done that. And I think it was a real differentiator. It's interesting because Microsoft actually participates in all of these, right? And I think a lot of companies do, right? Like, there's places where we're open for partners. We open source the Linux agent that we run on your Azure VMs because we want our customers to see the code so they trust that we're not doing stuff inside their VMs that they don't know about. Right? We do some single vendor open source with .NET, TypeScript, things like that. We collaborate on the Linux kernel. We have a Linux kernel team, and we collaborate to make sure that it runs great on Azure and contribute Linux code. And then we're very active in a bunch of these open source communities, and in fact, in some ways, in building more community around projects like Chromium. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff like this that we do, and obviously GitHub was pretty exciting as well. I wanted to spend the rest of the time here that I have available to me talking about how we actually go about building communities and learning some of the stuff that I learned over the course of developing Kubernetes. And this is sort of the order of magnitude thing, right? In the first 10, I feel like it's not really about the open source community at all. It's really about like every other software project you've ever done. Get the unit testing right, get the integration testing right, get the frameworks right so that people can develop software together. Developing software by yourself is usually very easy. Developing software in a small group, you start having to have more automation. You need documentation. You're going to have people come and go. The first 10 is really about that, getting that infrastructure right, getting the patterns and the rhythm of the place. And it's essential because, of course, small changes in trajectory early on have dramatic impact out into the future, right? So if you get it wrong and you're testing, and we actually had some of these problems where like we didn't have enough testing, and actually a historical sin that is still present in Kubernetes effectively is we've got some really good unit testing, and we've got some really good like full-on run-a-cluster integration testing. And the space in the middle where you do sort of like lightweight integration testing was never really focused on, and as a result, it's really, there's not enough there, and it's a problem, right? And if we'd done a better job in the first minutes of the project getting that little space right, we would be in a better place in some ways infrastructurally. And so it's really important to get all the pieces into the right place. When you move on to the next 100, the interesting thing is it's like, okay, now we're too big, right? We can't have that little tight-knit coordination thing going on. We need to break up. We need to be in smaller teams. We need to be having leads. We need to be automating things so that a contribution that I make over here, I'm doing pre-merge validation so that it doesn't break some other component that I don't really understand. You need to do all of the sorts of things that happen as you go from being able to all hold it in your head to being able to only really hold little bits and pieces of it in your head at any particular time. And then you start to work on planning. Because now suddenly cross-cutting features, you have to synchronize this person's work and this person's work. All right, then as you go beyond, and this is something that a lot of projects haven't hit, and we had to just sort of explore, it's like the problems just multiply, right? And you start worrying about delegating responsibility, sub-teams around release and security, and how do you manage these sort of verticalized bits of your project. How do you do meetups and conferences, and where are the bottlenecks into people orienting your project? And it becomes this like the management of the project itself becomes a task unto itself, right? And then the other thing is, of course, like every person you add to the project increases the probability that you're going to unfortunately run into a bad actor. And so at 1,000, I mean, probably by the time you're at 100, you have one. By the time you have 1,000, you have 3 or 4. And so you need to start thinking about, maybe more, unfortunately, you need to start thinking about how do you figure that out? How do you identify and police people who are in your community and who are not contributing to your community in a positive way? And then also, how do you set a coherent direction? Because suddenly there's going to be a bunch of leads and all sorts of people, and like, how do we all know where we're going? right? That is a really interesting thing. I think that going through that process, you learn a lot about how to manage a project, and you realize that at some point, like I know we're all a bunch of developers, and but sooner or later you're going to need product managers. You're going to need project managers, and the more I spend time in these communities, the more I realize getting that voice of the community back is an incredibly important part of the job. Organizing the work, making sure everybody feels happy is an incredibly important part of the job. And you need to do that, distributing the work and managing all of the execution. I think the next piece of this is you have to think about how are you going to manage needs and expectations, right? I think one of the interesting things you see in these projects is to become more and more mission critical, and this was alluded to a little bit, is that suddenly you're mission critical to some company, but they're not paying you, and so how do you balance that, right? How do you balance the fact that, yeah, you know what, you signed up for this, right? You didn't sign up to be a developer sitting in your, by yourself working on something by yourself. You signed up because you wanted your project to be useful and used by the world. And part of being useful and used by the world means fixing people's bugs, right? But at the same time, you're on vacation with your family for the first time in a year, and somebody needs a bug fixed. It's not the right time, right? So you have to figure out how do you balance those trade-offs. It's a really important part. And I think there's not enough focus on this on both sides, right? I think there's a lot of open source people who say, woe is me. People keep asking for me to fix stuff, and I kind of want to say, you know what? You signed up for it. But on the same time, there's a bunch of people who I've seen be incredibly bad actors about demanding and how can you possibly and et cetera, and you're like, dude, it's free, right? There's this and it's a collaboration. So, and I think that's tricky, right? And it's really tricky to get right. The piece of this that I want to think about even more is how do you govern a project. This was an amazing learning experience for me, and I think for everybody on the leadership team in the Kubernetes community. And I think that this was something where we really had to figure it out on the fly. And I think one of the things we did when we realized we needed governance, we had this sort of moment when we were like, oh, wow, we need governance, was that there was just tribal knowledge all over the place. And no one knew, we did these surveys where people would be like, I'm incredibly excited about your project. I have no idea where it's going or how to contribute. And you're like, that is a bad problem, right? And so I think that we really realized that we had to be more explicit. We had to put in the right structures so that people just knew how to help, right? But there were a bunch of non-goals too, right? I didn't think we're not interested in directing the project. We're not interested in giving people power. We're really just interested in clarifying how this thing is run so that everybody's on the same page. And I want to say that if you ever create an open source project, this is what your initial governance is going to look like, right? And I've even learned this, right? I've lived this thing, and I'm pretty sure that this is still what the next project that I do as governance is going to look like, right? You get the governance that evolves over time because in the 10-person stage, governance is pointless. It just slows you down. So you'll evolve to a point where there are rules and there are ideas and there is structure about how things will be done. It's just none of it will be written down anywhere, right? And that's bad. Because at a point, the new people can't figure it out. Initially, the tribe just sort of educates the people who join the tribe, but eventually, you have to codify things. And the important decision here is, how are you going to do it? And there's a bunch of different models for open source about how you do this. There's the BDFL model, which personally I hate. There's the hierarchical model, which I don't really like, and is sort of against the sort of tenets of open source, I think, in general. Although I think you can point at examples of this, right? Linux is very hierarchical. Python was very BDFL. And then there's the last one, which is the sort of collaborative communal design, which is what I prefer, but my goodness, is it a mess, right? It's hard to explain to somebody, right? And so in that vacuum, you have to step in and really create governance. And you need to do it before the thing gets sick. And I think we got really lucky that we stepped in and started to work on governance, and the project was still operating pretty healthily. Because if you don't, you're going to be in a situation where it's an emergency. And we got really lucky. I mean, really, the first real emergency came 2 to 3 months after we started to form governance, where we had some of the initial structures in place. And it was just such a wake-up call. And so I think it's incredibly important as we think about how we grow these communities to be thinking about what are our checkups? How do we know what's going on? Do we have the right things in the right places? And one of the, I mean, the most important piece of this, I think, that has come out in the last 3 or 4 years is this notion of a code of conduct. Like every single project, it should be right next to your license file. Like, you want to start a project, you're going to need 3 things. You're going to need a README, you're going to need a license file, and you're going to need a code of conduct. And you should not start a project without those things. Because that's the framework, that's the grounding, that's the things that set the right stage. This is sort of my summary of every code of conduct, because I'm from the 80s and Bill and Ted's. But I mean, for me, it was really shocking, because I was like, this is just no-brainer stuff. We're professionals, be nice. But it turns out 1,000 people, roll the dice, there are people who don't get that. And so you have to write these things down so that you can say, yeah, this is where we said, and by being part of this, you agreed to this. And if not, here's the door, right? And that's incredibly important, and I would like us to start moving on that. I think the other thing is we need to make sure that we focus on healthy dialogues. I'm going to run through. I'm running out of time, so apologies. We focus on building healthy dialogues. We're going to have disagreements. We have to do it in a real way, in an honest way, in a way that we move the project forward, but that also we're respectful. I think one of the most amazing things that we did in Kubernetes was build a really welcoming community. That meant a lot to me, and I think it's still one of the most important contributions that we've made to open source. This is something I think we've had a harder time with. I think we had a lot of pretty burned out people at different times. It's tricky. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was the fact that forks, I think, and not, I tried to get a Twilight reference in here. Does any, no, maybe, sort of, yeah. It didn't work. Like, I couldn't figure how to get it in, but not that kind of forks. I think we have to think about forks as the ultimate escape hatch. A fork is the way that a project tells you that it's unhealthy. It's actually a good thing. When we thought about governance, one of the things we always said is, hey, you know what? The greatest thing about establishing all of this governance is if we really screw it up, someone will fork. And at the end of the day, I think that's one of the other most amazing pieces of open source is that if the technology and the project that you're building is useful, you can even screw up the governance and the project will continue to survive. It's hard, but it will continue to survive. And it's an important check and balance that the community has to basically, sort of kick the people who are in charge out. And I think that's a really important piece of how we move forward together. All right, so hopefully that gives you a perspective of my history in open source, an idea about what open source is like, how we build these giant communities. I'll be around. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the conference.